"Ma'am, open the door now." The command hit the wood before the second knock ever came, and then the sound of splintering echoed through the hallway like something final, something that couldn't be taken back. Naomi Carter jerked awake on the couch, the TV still flickering muted light across the small living room, her heartbeat slamming hard against her ribs as cold air rushed in from the broken frame. Flashlights cut through the dark in sharp, white beams, sweeping across her face. The walls, the narrow hallway that still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and last night's coffee. "Hands where I can see them," a voice barked, firm, practiced, already certain. Naomi didn't move right away, not out of defiance, but because her body hadn't caught up to the moment yet. The clock on the wall read 2:03 a.m., glowing red and indifferent. She slowly raised her hands, palms open, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "What is this?" Boots stepped in, heavy, controlled, spreading out with purpose. Officer Daniel Hayes entered last, his presence quieter but heavier than the rest, eyes scanning, calculating, already writing a story in his head that placed her exactly where he expected. "Where is he?" he asked, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through everything else. Naomi blinked, still seated, the thin blanket slipping from her lap onto the floor. "I don't know what you're talking about." The beam of a flashlight lingered on her face a second longer than necessary, then moved on, inspecting shelves, corners, shadows that held nothing but ordinary life. Hayes stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath him, his voice lowering like it was meant only for her. "We have reason to believe a suspect ran through this unit. So I'll ask again, where is he?" Naomi swallowed, her gaze flicking briefly toward the hallway, not out of guilt, but instinct, as if measuring how far this moment might go. "You've got the wrong place." A short silence followed, not empty, but tight, filled with the sound of fabric shifting, equipment brushing against walls, the faint hum of electricity in the ceiling light that someone had flipped on without asking. One of the younger officers paused, near the bookshelf, eyes lingering on something, but didn't speak. Hayes didn't notice. He was still focused on Naomi, still reading her through a lens that had already decided who she was. "People say that all the time," he replied, almost casually, but there was an edge under it, something colder than procedure. Naomi didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She just held his gaze, steady, grounded, like she was standing on something he couldn't see. Somewhere behind him, a beam of light drifted across the far wall, brushing over a coat rack by the hallway, catching for just a second on a dark jacket hanging there, the letters barely visible in the dim glow before the light moved on. Naomi noticed. She said nothing. The room settled into a strange stillness, like the moment right before something shifts, when no one realizes yet that everything is about to change. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and uneasy, like something fragile pulled too tight. Naomi remained exactly where she was, hands still raised, shoulders relaxed but not weak, her breathing slow and controlled as if she had already decided she would not match their urgency with panic. Officer Hayes shifted his weight, the faint creak of leather echoing louder than it should have in the small room. He glanced around again, this time slower, noticing details he had skipped before. The couch was worn but clean. The coffee table held neatly stacked case files, not clutter, not chaos. A pen rested perfectly aligned on top of a legal pad filled with tight, precise handwriting. Nothing about the space suggested someone hiding anything. "Search the back," he said, not raising his voice, but the order landed heavy. Two officers moved past Naomi toward the hallway, their boots softer now, almost cautious, as if the apartment itself demanded a different kind of respect. Naomi followed them with her eyes for a brief second, then returned her gaze to Hayes. "You are wasting your time," she said quietly. There was no edge, no challenge, just certainty. Hayes let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh, not quite patience. "We will decide that." He stepped closer, close. Enough now that the beam from another officer's flashlight brushed across both of them, cutting their faces into sharp light and shadow. For a moment, neither spoke. Naomi's eyes did not drop. That seemed to unsettle him more than anything she could have said. From the hallway came the soft sound of drawers opening, then closing, slower than before, less aggressive, more careful. One of the officers paused again near the wall, his light drifting back toward the coat rack. This time it lingered longer. The fabric of the jacket caught the beam, dark blue, heavy, structured. The letters were clearer now, bold, unmistakable, but he did not say anything yet. Instead, he swallowed, his gaze flicking toward Hayes, then back to the jacket as if he needed to be sure of what he was seeing. Naomi noticed the hesitation. She lowered her hands slowly, not in defiance, but because no one stopped her. The shift was subtle, but it mattered. Hayes saw it too. "I did not tell you to lower your hands," he said, though his voice had lost a fraction of its earlier certainty. Naomi did not raise them again. She simply let them rest at her sides, calm, grounded. "You did not need to," she replied. The words were soft, but they carried weight, like something placed carefully on a scale. Hayes frowned slightly, his attention splitting now between her and the quiet tension building behind him. "Clear," one of the officers called from the bedroom, but the word lacked confidence, like it did not quite belong in the space anymore. Another officer stepped back into the living room, slower than before, his expression unreadable. His eyes flicked toward the coat rack again, then to Hayes. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it. Naomi watched the exchange without turning her head. The room felt different now, not loud, not aggressive, but heavy, like the air had thickened. Hayes noticed the shift, even if he did not understand it yet. "What is it?" he asked, sharper this time, trying to pull control back into his voice. The younger officer finally spoke, quieter than expected. "Sir." He did not finish the sentence. Instead, he lifted his chin slightly toward the wall. Hayes followed the gesture, irritation flashing briefly across his face before his eyes landed on the jacket. The beam of light settled on it fully now, no longer passing, no longer uncertain. The letters stood clear, white against dark fabric, reflecting just enough to catch attention and hold it. For a second, nothing moved. Not a breath, not a step. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, the soft sound of her bare feet against the hardwood breaking the stillness more than any voice could have. She turned her head just enough to glance at the jacket, then back to Hayes. "You should probably look a little closer," she said. There was no smugness in her tone, no satisfaction, only quiet instruction, like she was guiding someone towards something obvious they had missed. Hayes stared at the jacket, his jaw tightening, the story he had built seconds ago beginning to crack at the edges. Behind him, the officers stood still, waiting, no longer moving through the apartment, no longer searching. The urgency that had filled the room moments earlier had drained away, replaced by something slower, heavier, harder to ignore. Naomi took a single step forward, not toward him, but toward the space between them, her presence steady, unshaken. The light caught her face again, but this time it did not frame fear. It framed control. And for the first time since the door had opened, no one told her what to do. Hayes did not move right away, and that hesitation said more than anything else in the room. His eyes stayed fixed on the jacket, as if staring long enough might change what it was, might turn those letters into something else, something harmless, something that did not rewrite the last 2 minutes of his actions. But the fabric did not shift, and the letters did not blur. They remained sharp, clear, undeniable. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The younger officer lowered his flashlight slightly, the beam no longer scanning, no longer searching, just resting awkwardly against the floor like it had lost its purpose. No one spoke. Even the hum of the ceiling light seemed louder now, filling the silence that none of them knew how to break. Naomi took another small step forward, her movement measured, controlled, her posture unchanged. She was not reclaiming space. She had never given it up. Hayes finally inhaled, slow, deliberate, like he was recalibrating something inside himself. His voice, when it came, was quieter, stripped of the edge it carried before. "Why is that jacket here?" It was the wrong question, and he knew it the second it left his mouth. Naomi tilted her head just slightly, not mocking, not confrontational, just acknowledging the shift. "You already know the answer to that," she said. The words landed calmly, but they carried weight, the kind that settled into the room and stayed there. Hayes swallowed, his gaze flicking briefly to the officers behind him, but none of them offered anything back. They were waiting, not for instructions, but for clarity, for something to anchor themselves to now that the ground had shifted. Naomi turned her body just enough to face the coat rack fully, her eyes resting on the jacket for a brief second before returning to Hayes. "You came in here looking for someone," she continued, her voice even. "You were so sure of what you would find that you did not stop to look at what was already in front of you." Hayes felt the words more than he heard them. His shoulders tightened slightly, the confidence that had guided him moments ago now replaced with something heavier, something slower. "We had a report," he said, but the explanation sounded thin, incomplete, like it belonged to a different moment. Naomi nodded once, not dismissing it, but not accepting it either. "And now you have new information." The simplicity of it left no room to hide. Behind Hayes, one of the officers shifted his stance, the soft scrape of his boot against the floor cutting through the quiet. Another lowered his gaze, studying the ground as if it held something easier to understand than the situation unfolding around them. Hayes finally took a step back, not a retreat, but a recalibration, his eyes returning to Naomi with a different focus now, less assumption, more awareness. "Are you saying you work for them?" he asked, though the answer was already clear. Naomi did not respond immediately. She let the silence stretch just long, enough to make the question feel unnecessary. Then she walked past him, her movement smooth, unhurried, crossing the small space toward the coat rack. No one stopped her. No one told her to. The shift was complete now. She reached for the jacket, her fingers brushing the fabric with familiarity, not as a reveal, but as confirmation. When she turned back, the light caught the badge clipped just inside the fold, metal reflecting softly, not dramatic, just present. "I am saying," she replied, her voice steady, "that you forced your way into the wrong place tonight." The words did not rise, did not accuse, but they landed with precision. Hayes looked at the badge, then at her, then back again, as if trying to align the image with the version of her he had built in his head just minutes earlier. It did not fit. None of it did. The younger officer straightened slightly, instinctively, his posture shifting from search to attention without being told. Another officer took a half step back, creating space that had not existed before. Naomi held the jacket loosely in one hand, not wearing it, not needing to, her presence alone now enough to redefine the room. Hayes exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling fully into his chest. For the first time, he did not look like the one in control. He looked like someone catching up to a reality that had already moved past him. Naomi watched him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a quiet expectation, as if what came next would say more about him than anything that had already happened. And in that silence, the authority that had entered the room minutes ago stood still, waiting, unsure of its next move. The room did not return to normal. It shifted into something quieter, heavier, like a place where every movement had to be reconsidered before it happened. Hayes stood still for a second longer than necessary, then straightened slightly, not in authority, but in awareness, as if he had just realized he was being observed in a way he had not expected. His eyes moved from the badge to Naomi's face again, searching for something that would let him regain footing, but there was nothing to hold on to except the truth, sitting plainly in front of him. "We did not know," he said finally, the words careful, measured, but lacking the certainty they once carried. Naomi did not respond right away. She let the sentence exist in the space, let it settle, as if deciding whether it deserved an answer. Behind Hayes, one of the officers shifted his stance and quietly turned off his flashlight, the beam disappearing and leaving the room lit only by the overhead light, softer now, less invasive. Another officer adjusted his posture, no longer scanning, no longer searching, just standing, waiting. Naomi took a slow breath, her grip on the jacket relaxed, her shoulders steady. "You did not look," she said, her voice calm, not raised, not sharp, but precise. The difference mattered. Hayes felt it. He glanced briefly toward the coat rack again, then back to her, the weight of that distinction settling deeper than any accusation could have. "We had a call about a suspect moving through this building," he said, as if repeating it might rebuild something. But the explanation sounded smaller now, thinner, like it no longer carried authority on its own. Naomi stepped past him, not brushing against him, not forcing space, just moving with quiet certainty toward the small table by the wall. She set the jacket down gently, then opened a drawer without hesitation. The soft slide of wood against wood echoed in the silence. When she turned back, the badge was in her hand, held low, not displayed, not used as a weapon, just present. "And that justified this?" she asked, her tone unchanged. But the question hung heavier than before. Hayes opened his mouth, then paused. For the first time, he did not have a ready answer. The officers behind him remained still, their attention now fixed not on Naomi as a subject, but on the exchange unfolding between them. One of them glanced toward the doorway, where the broken frame still leaned slightly inward, the night air drifting through the opening, carrying the distant hum of the city. It made the room feel exposed, not just physically, but morally. Hayes followed that glance for a brief second, then returned his focus to Naomi. "We followed protocol," he said, but the words felt automatic, detached from the moment. Naomi studied him for a second, not harshly, but thoroughly, as if weighing not just what he said, but what he believed. "Protocol is supposed to protect people," she replied, "not bypass them." The statement landed without force, but it did not need it. It stayed in the air, impossible to ignore. Hayes shifted again, the movement subtle, but it broke whatever remained of his earlier stance. "If there has been a mistake," he began, the sentence forming slowly, carefully, "we can address it." Naomi's gaze did not change. "There has been more than one," she said quietly. Another silence followed, deeper this time, not just uncertainty, but recognition. One of the younger officers lowered his head slightly, his hands resting at his sides, no longer holding anything, no longer prepared for action. The tension that had filled the room earlier had not disappeared, but it had changed direction. It no longer pointed at Naomi. It settled instead on the people who had entered, on the assumptions they had carried with them. Naomi walked toward the doorway, stopping just short of the broken frame. She looked at it for a moment, the splintered wood, the way it no longer fit into place, the way it marked exactly where control had been forced instead of earned. She did not touch it. She just let the image sit there, visible to everyone in the room. Then she turned back slowly, her eyes meeting Hayes's again. "Do you understand what this looks like?" she asked. Hayes did not answer immediately. His jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in thought. He looked around the apartment again, seeing it now not as a target, but as a space that had been interrupted, a life that had been stepped into without permission. "Yes," he said finally, the word quiet, but real. Naomi held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. The room stayed still, no one moving to leave yet, no one rushing to fix what had been done. And in that stillness, the power that had once filled the space had nowhere to stand, leaving only the weight of what remained. The air did not lighten after his answer. It settled heavier, as if acknowledgement alone was not enough to undo what had already been set in motion. Hayes stood there, the word yes still lingering between them, but it did not restore anything. It only confirmed that he understood, and that understanding carried its own weight. Naomi turned slightly, her gaze moving past him toward the rest of the officers, each of them standing in a different kind of stillness now. Some avoided her eyes. Others held them for a second too long, unsure what was expected of them in a room where their authority had quietly dissolved. The broken doorway remained open behind them, the night pressing in with a cool draft that brushed against Naomi's bare arms, a reminder that this moment had started outside and forced its way in. She walked slowly back toward the center of the room, not hurried, not tense, just present, as if reclaiming the space did not require effort, only time. The soft sound of her footsteps against the hardwood floor filled the silence in a way that no command had earlier. Hayes watched her, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders slightly lowered, as if the weight he carried had shifted inward. "We can file a report," he said after a moment, his voice controlled but quieter, less certain of its place. "For the damage." Naomi paused, not turning to face him immediately. The words hung there, small against everything else. She glanced briefly toward the doorway, then back to the room, taking in the displaced air, the disrupted stillness, the fact that something intangible had already been altered beyond repair. "This is not about a report," she said calmly. Hayes nodded once, slow, almost automatic, but he did not interrupt. He did not try to correct her. That, more than anything, marked the shift. Naomi moved toward the table again, placing the badge down carefully beside the legal pad, a aligning it with the same precision that had been there before. The small gesture seemed insignificant, but it restored something, a quiet order that had been interrupted. One of the younger officers noticed it, his eyes following the motion, as if realizing for the first time that this was not just a place, it was a life. Structured with intention. Hayes took a breath, deeper this time, and stepped slightly to the side, giving her a clearer line of movement without being asked. "What do you want us to do?" he asked. The question came out slower than his earlier commands, shaped by uncertainty rather than authority. Naomi looked at him then, really looked, not just at the uniform, not just at the role, but at the person behind it, measuring something beyond the moment. "Right now," she said. "Nothing." The answer landed differently than expected. Not dismissive, not final, but deliberate. Hayes blinked once, as if recalibrating again. "Nothing," he repeated quietly. Naomi nodded. "You have already done enough for one night." The words were not harsh, but they carried a finality that did not invite argument. Behind him, one of the officers shifted toward the door, not rushing, just moving with a sense that the moment had ended even if no one had formally said it. Another followed, slower, glancing once more at Naomi before stepping out into the hallway. The room began to empty, not with the urgency it had filled with earlier, but with a quiet withdrawal, each step softer than the last. Hayes remained where he was for a second longer, his eyes moving once more across the apartment, seeing it now not as a scene, not as a target, but as something he had entered without understanding. The couch, the files, the aligned pen, the jacket now resting calmly on the chair. Each detail felt different now, heavier, clearer. Naomi walked toward the doorway as well, stopping just inside the frame, her presence steady, not blocking, not inviting, just there. Hayes stepped toward the threshold, then paused, turning slightly back toward her. "This will not happen again," he said. The statement was quiet, but it carried intention. Naomi held his gaze, not immediately responding, letting the words settle, testing their weight. "Make sure it does not," she replied. No anger, no raised voice, just expectation. Hayes nodded once, then stepped out into the hallway, the sound of his boots fading as he joined the others. The apartment fell still again, but it was not the same stillness as before. The air held memory now, a faint tension that had not fully dissipated. Naomi stood in the doorway for a moment longer, listening as the building returned to its quiet rhythm, distant doors closing, footsteps receding. Then she reached out slowly and pushed the broken door as far as it would go, aligning it as best she could within the frame. It did not close fully. It could not. She rested her hand against the wood for a second, feeling the rough edge where it had split, then let it fall. The room behind her remained softly lit, unchanged in its arrangement, but altered in something deeper, something less visible. Naomi turned back inside, her movements calm, her breathing steady, as if the moment had passed through her without breaking anything essential. But the silence that followed was different now, not empty, not neutral, but aware. And in that quiet, the truth of what had happened lingered longer than any voice ever could. The hallway swallowed the last echo of footsteps, and then there was nothing but the low hum of the city outside and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, steady, indifferent, as if time had never noticed what had just happened. Naomi stood in the center of the room for a moment, not moving, not rushing to fix anything, just letting the silence settle around her, letting her breathing return to its natural rhythm. The broken door remained slightly ajar behind her, the edge uneven, letting in a thin line of cooler air that brushed against her skin like a reminder that something had crossed a boundary it could not fully repair. She walked slowly toward it, placing her hand against the wood again, this time pressing a little firmer, testing the resistance, measuring what could be restored and what could not. The frame did not give. It stayed misaligned, a quiet fact she did not argue with. She stepped back and turned toward the room, her eyes scanning it the way someone does after something has been interrupted, not checking for damage, but for meaning. The couch still held the shape where she had been sitting earlier. The blanket lay half on the floor, untouched. The legal pad remained open on the table, the pen still aligned, but now the space around it felt different, like the air itself had shifted weight. Naomi crossed the room and picked up the blanket, folding it carefully, smoothing the edges with slow, deliberate movements. It was not about the blanket. It was about restoring a rhythm, a sense of control that did not need to be loud to exist. She placed it back on the couch, then paused, her gaze drifting toward the badge resting beside the legal pad. For a moment, she did not pick it up. She just looked at it, the metal catching the light in a soft reflection, not bright, not demanding attention, just present. Then she reached for it, holding it in her hand with a familiarity that did not come from pride, but from responsibility. The weight of it was the same as always, but the meaning felt sharper now, closer to the surface. She set it back down, exactly where it had been, aligning it again with the same precision, as if that small act could anchor everything else that had shifted. A faint sound came from the hallway, a distant door closing, followed by silence again. Naomi exhaled slowly and moved toward the kitchen, filling a glass with water, the soft rush from the faucet cutting cleanly through the quiet. She took a sip, the coolness grounding her, then set the glass down on the counter without finishing it. Her reflection caught briefly in the window above the sink, faint against the darkness outside. She looked at it for a second, not searching for reassurance, just acknowledging herself in the aftermath of something that had not broken her, but had left a mark in a way that could not be seen. Turning back, she walked toward the small table again and picked up the legal pad, her eyes scanning the last line she had written earlier that night. The words were still there, unchanged, but her focus lingered on them differently now, as if they belonged to a version of the night that had already passed. She set the pad down and leaned her hands lightly against the edge of the table, her fingers resting near the badge, close enough to feel its presence without touching it again. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer empty. It held the weight of what had happened, the echo of voices that were no longer there, the absence of authority that had once filled the space so abruptly. Naomi straightened slowly, her shoulders relaxed, her posture steady, and walked toward the coat rack. She lifted the jacket and draped it over her arm, not putting it on, not needing to, just holding it as she moved back toward the doorway. She stood there again, looking at the broken frame, the line where control had forced its way in without understanding what it was entering. Her gaze lingered for a second longer, then shifted outward into the hallway, now empty, quiet, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. She stepped forward and gently pulled the door as close as it would go once more, the wood stopping just short of meeting the frame, leaving a narrow gap that could not be ignored. Naomi did not try again. She turned back into the room, her movements calm, measured, and placed the jacket carefully over the back of the chair. Then she reached for the light switch and paused, her hand hovering for a second as she looked across the apartment, taking in the stillness, the order, the quiet strength that remained untouched beneath everything else. She turned the light off. The room dimmed, leaving only the faint glow from the street filtering through the window, soft and steady. Naomi stood there for a moment in the low light, her breathing even, her presence grounded, as if the night had tested something and found it unshaken. And in that quiet darkness, nothing needed to be said for the truth of it to remain. The darkness did not feel empty. It felt settled, like the room had exhaled and chosen to stay quiet instead of returning to what it had been before. Naomi stood there for a few seconds longer, letting her eyes adjust to the low light, the faint glow from the street tracing soft outlines across the furniture, the table, the coat draped carefully over the chair. The broken door still held its shape against the frame, a thin line of night cutting into the room, not loud, not demanding, just present. She walked slowly toward the couch and sat down, not collapsing into it, but lowering herself with control, her back straight at first, then easing into the cushion as her body finally acknowledged the hour. The clock still read past 2 in the morning, the numbers steady, unchanged, as if time had moved forward without asking permission. Naomi rested her hands loosely in her lap, her fingers still, her breathing even, but her eyes remained open, fixed on the space ahead, not unfocused, just thinking. The night had not startled her in the way it might have someone else. It had not broken her rhythm, but it had revealed something familiar in a way she did not need to name out loud. Assumptions, speed, certainty without pause. She had seen it before, in different rooms, under different lights, carried by different voices that all believed they were justified until they were forced to stop and look again. Naomi leaned her head back slightly, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling, following the faint line where the light met shadow. Her mind did not race. It moved slowly, deliberately, like she was sorting through pieces that did not need to be rushed. The sound of a car passing outside rolled softly through the gap in the door, then faded, leaving the building quiet again. She pushed herself up from the couch after a moment, her movement smooth, unhurried, and walked back toward the table. The badge remained where she had placed it, catching just enough light to remain visible. She picked it up again, turning it slightly in her hand, the metal cool against her fingers. There was no pride in the gesture, no sense of power, only recognition. This was not about what she was. It was about what people chose to see before they knew. She set it back down once more, exactly aligned, then reached for the legal pad, flipping it closed this time, the soft sound marking a quiet into whatever she had been working on before the night had shifted. Naomi carried the pad to the side table near the couch and placed it there, clearing the main surface as if preparing the room to return to something simpler, something untouched. Her eyes moved again to the door. It had not changed. It would not change tonight. She walked over to it and gently pressed her palm against the wood again, not testing it this time, just feeling it, acknowledging the boundary that had been crossed and the space that still belonged to her regardless. She stepped back and reached for a chair, moving it carefully across the floor, the soft scrape barely breaking the silence. She positioned it near the door, angled just enough to hold it more securely in place, not as a barrier, but as a temporary answer. It was not perfect. It did not need to be. It was enough for now. Naomi turned back into the room, her movement steady, and walked toward the kitchen again, finishing the glass of water in a few slow sips before setting it in the sink. She rinsed it briefly, the quiet rush of water filling the space for a moment, then turned it off, letting the silence return once more. As she stepped back into the living room, her eyes caught the jacket draped over the chair. She paused, studying it for a second, then reached for it, lifting it with both hands. The fabric settled naturally, familiar in its weight, its structure. She held it close for a moment, not putting it on, just grounding herself in something known, something earned, something that did not shift based on who walked through the door. Then she folded it carefully and placed it over the arm of the couch instead, within reach, not displayed, not hidden. The room felt smaller now, not in size, but in focus, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only what mattered. Naomi walked back to the couch and sat down again, this time leaning slightly forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her hands loosely clasped. She looked toward the door one last time, then let her gaze settle somewhere in the middle distance, not fixed on anything, just present. The night moved quietly around her, unchanged, steady, and in that stillness, the truth of what had happened did not need to be repeated. It had already settled into the space, into the walls, into the quiet strength of someone who had not needed to raise her voice to be heard. And as the minutes passed, Naomi did not rush to sleep, did not rush to forget. She simply remained there, grounded, calm, and fully aware, as if the night had revealed something that would stay long after the door was fixed and the hallway returned to silence. The minutes did not announce themselves as they passed. They slipped quietly through the room, measured only by the soft ticking of the clock and the steady rhythm of Naomi's breathing as she remained seated on the couch, her posture relaxed but alert, her eyes open, not searching, just present. The city outside had begun to soften, the distant sounds thinning out, the occasional car rolling by slower now, like even the streets were settling into the late hour. The narrow gap in the door let in a faint current of cooler air that brushed across the floor and up along the edges of the room, carrying with it the quiet hum of a world that had not noticed what had happened inside these walls. Naomi shifted slightly, leaning back into the couch, her gaze drifting once more toward the door, then away, as if she had already decided she would not let it define the rest of the night. She reached for the jacket resting beside her, lifting it again with both hands, her fingers smoothing the fabric along the sleeve, tracing the stitching with a familiarity that came from repetition, from years of wearing it in rooms where she had to prove less and observe more. She did not put it on. Instead, she folded it once more, tighter this time, and placed it neatly beside her on the couch, within reach, like something she could choose when needed, not something she had to display. Her eyes moved to the table again, to the badge, to the closed legal pad, to the pen still resting exactly where it had been before everything shifted. The order in the room had not been destroyed, only interrupted, and now it was returning piece by piece, not forced, just allowed. Naomi leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on her knees, her hands clasped loosely, her fingers still. The silence around her was no longer tense. It was full, grounded, like something steady had taken its place where uncertainty had briefly entered. A faint sound came from the hallway again, softer this time, footsteps passing by, hesitant, as if whoever walked there was aware of the door that did not quite close. Naomi did not turn toward it. She did not need to. The moment had already passed. Whatever curiosity remained outside belonged to others, not to her. She straightened slowly and stood, her movement smooth, and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain slightly aside. The street below was dim, washed in amber light from the street lamps, the sidewalks mostly empty, the world continuing in quiet routine. She let the curtain fall back into place and turned away, her reflection briefly catching in the glass, faint and steady. Moving back toward the center of the room, she paused near the table, her hand hovering over the badge again before she picked it up one more time, not out of habit, but out of thought. She turned it slightly in her hand, watching how the light shifted across its surface, then lowered it, her gaze thoughtful, measured. "Not tonight," she said softly to herself, the words barely above a whisper, not a refusal, not a dismissal, just a decision. She placed the badge back down and slid it gently toward the edge of the table, closer to the couch, within easier reach, as if preparing for what might come next, even if that next moment had not arrived yet. Naomi walked toward the door again, her steps quiet, and adjusted the chair slightly, making sure it held the door as firmly as it could, the wood pressing just enough to reduce the gap. It was not perfect, but it was enough for now. She stepped back and looked at it, not with frustration, but with acceptance, understanding that some things were not meant to be fixed immediately. Turning away, she dimmed the small lamp on the side table, leaving only a faint glow in the room, softer than before, more intentional. She returned to the couch and sat down again, this time leaning back fully, her head resting against the cushion, her eyes closing briefly, not in exhaustion, but in quiet recalibration. The night held steady around her, the silence no longer sharp, no longer fragile, but settled, like something that had been tested and remained intact. Naomi opened her eyes again after a moment, her gaze calm, her breathing even, and let the quiet carry her forward, not rushing, not resisting, just allowing the space to return to itself, one steady moment at a time. The quiet stretched longer this time, not fragile, not uncertain, but deep, like something that had settled into the walls and chosen to stay. Naomi remained on the couch, her eyes open again, not fully resting, not fully working, just present in the space between both. The faint glow from the lamp cast soft shadows along the floor, tracing the edges of the chair holding the door in place, the table, the badge resting closer now within reach. The room no longer felt interrupted. It felt aware. A distant siren passed somewhere far across the city, low and fading, and Naomi's eyes followed the sound without moving her head, a subtle shift in attention that came from instinct more than thought. She had learned long ago to listen without reacting, to observe without stepping in too quickly, to let moments reveal themselves before deciding what they meant. Her fingers moved slightly against the fabric of the couch, a small grounding motion, as if confirming that everything around her was still real, still hers. The air had cooled a little more, the thin gap in the door continuing to let in the night, but it no longer felt intrusive. It felt like a quiet reminder that the world outside moved without pause, regardless of what happened within these walls. Naomi sat up slowly, her posture shifting forward again, and reached for the badge without hesitation this time. She held it firmly, not examining it, not turning it, just holding it as if measuring its weight against the silence that surrounded her. For a brief moment, her gaze hardened, not with anger, but with clarity. What had happened was not new. It was not rare. It was simply visible tonight in a way it often was not. She placed the badge back down, closer still, aligning it instinctively, then leaned back again, exhaling slowly through her nose. The clock ticked past another minute. Then another. Time moved forward without asking for permission, and Naomi let it. A soft creak came from the hallway again, followed by a faint murmur of voices somewhere down the corridor, distant, uncertain, as if someone was speaking in lowered tones about something they did not fully understand. Naomi did not react. She did not need to. Whatever conversation existed outside this door did not belong to her. She had already faced the moment that mattered. Her eyes drifted toward the jacket once more, folded neatly beside her. She reached out and touched it lightly, her fingers resting on the fabric for a second before withdrawing. It was not about identity. It was about timing, knowing when to step forward, knowing when to remain still. Tonight had required both. Naomi stood again, her movements fluid, and walked toward the table, this time pulling out the chair and sitting down instead of returning to the couch. The shift was subtle but intentional. She placed the legal pad in front of her and opened it again, the paper catching the dim light. The last line she had written stared back at her, incomplete now in a way it had not been before. She picked up the pen, holding it between her fingers, but did not write immediately. Instead, she listened again, not to the hallway, not to the city, but to the quiet inside the room, to the rhythm of her own breathing, to the steady presence that had not been shaken. Then, slowly, she began to write, the sound of pen against paper soft but deliberate, each stroke measured, controlled, intentional. The words came without rush, shaped by clarity rather than urgency. This was not about documenting what had happened. It was about understanding what it meant. She paused after a few lines, her pen hovering slightly above the page, then continued, her expression unchanged, calm, focused, grounded. The room held steady around her, no longer reacting, no longer shifting, just present. The broken door remained where it was, the chair holding it as best it could, the gap still there, but it no longer demanded attention. It had become part of the space, a quiet fact that would be addressed in time. Naomi finished the line she was writing and set the pen down gently, her fingers resting on the edge of the paper. She did not reread it. She did not need to. She leaned back slightly in the chair, her gaze lifting from the page to the room, taking it in once more, not checking, not questioning, just acknowledging. The night had revealed something, and she had met it without raising her voice, without stepping outside herself. And now, as the silence settled fully into place again, Naomi sat there in the dim light, steady, composed, and entirely unshaken, letting the moment exist exactly as it was, without needing to change it. The pen rested where she had left it, and the words on the page no longer felt unfinished. They felt paused, like something waiting for the next piece to reveal itself. Naomi sat still at the table, her posture steady, her hands relaxed, her gaze drifting between the paper and the quiet room around her. The silence had settled into something deeper now, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of awareness, as if every object in the room held memory of what had passed through it. The chair against the door remained firm, angled just enough to hold the broken frame in place, the narrow line of night still visible, still letting in that faint current of cooler air. Naomi exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing as she leaned back slightly in the chair, her eyes closing for a brief moment, not out of exhaustion, but out of clarity. When she opened them again, something had shifted, not in the room, but in her focus. The night was no longer something to process. It had become something to act on. She reached for the badge again, this time without hesitation, and held it in her hand, her fingers tightening slightly around its edges. The metal felt colder now, sharper, like it carried more than just identity. It carried responsibility that did not wait for daylight. Naomi stood, her movement smooth, deliberate, and walked toward the coat rack, lifting the jacket from the chair where she had placed it earlier. This time, she did not fold it. She slipped it on, one arm, then the other, the fabric settling across her shoulders with a familiar weight that changed the shape of her presence without altering her calm. She adjusted the collar slightly, her movements precise, then reached for the badge, clipping it into place inside the jacket where it rested naturally, not displayed, but ready. The room did not react, but it felt different again, as if something had aligned. Naomi turned toward the table and picked up her phone, the screen lighting softly in the dim space. She did not scroll. She did not hesitate. She dialed. The tone rang once, then twice, then connected. "Carter," she said, her voice low, steady, controlled. There was no urgency, but there was intention. A voice on the other end responded, quiet, alert. Naomi listened for a moment, her eyes moving toward the door, toward the space where the night still pressed in. "I need a cross-check on a call that came through this building," she continued, her tone unchanged. "Timestamp 2:03 a.m. Dispatch origin, responding unit, and authorization chain." She paused, listening again, her gaze steady. "Yes, I am aware of the entry," she added calmly. "No, there was no confirmation on target presence." Another pause. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "That is what I thought," she said quietly. "Pull body cam logs as well. I want full sequence, not summary." She ended the call without another word and lowered the phone slowly, her fingers resting lightly against its edge before placing it back on the table. The room remained still, but now it held purpose. Naomi walked toward the door again, her steps quiet but certain, and stood just inside the frame, her eyes scanning the hallway beyond. It was empty, silent, unchanged, but she looked at it differently now, not as a space that had intruded, but as a path that had revealed something worth following. She reached out and adjusted the chair slightly, making sure the door held as securely as it could for now, then stepped back. The temporary fix would remain. What mattered next was not here. Naomi turned away from the door and walked back into the center of the room, her posture straight, her presence grounded, the jacket now part of her stance, not as armor, but as alignment. She picked up the legal pad once more and tore off the top page cleanly, folding it once before slipping it into the inside pocket of her jacket. The rest of the pad she set down neatly, the pen placed across it with the same precision as before. Nothing in the room was left out of place. Nothing was rushed. Naomi moved toward the light switch. Again, her hand pausing for a brief second before she turned the overhead light back on. The room brightened, not harsh, but clear, every detail visible, every object returned to focus. The broken door, the chair, the table, the badge now no longer resting but carried, the space no longer just hers for the night, but part of something larger unfolding. She stood there for a moment, taking it in, then reached for her phone again, slipping it into her pocket. Her breathing remained even, her expression unchanged, but her direction had shifted completely. This was no longer just a night that had happened. It was a line that had been crossed, and Naomi Carter did not leave lines unexplored. She stepped toward the door, stopping just short of it, her hand resting briefly against the frame, feeling the rough edge where it had split. Then she let it fall, turned slightly, and walked back into the room one last time, her eyes scanning it not as someone recovering, but as someone preparing. And in that quiet, steady movement, the next part of the night had already begun. The light stayed on this time, steady and clear, casting no shadows deep enough to hide anything, and Naomi moved through the room with quiet intention, each step measured as if she was aligning more than just objects, as if she was aligning the moment itself. The jacket settled naturally on her shoulders, the badge resting inside, unseen but present, and her gaze moved once more to the door before shifting away, no longer anchored to what had happened but to what it meant. She reached for her phone again, not rushing, her fingers steady as she checked the screen, a new message already waiting. She opened it, her eyes scanning quickly, absorbing without reacting outwardly. Dispatch log confirmed. Entry authorized on incomplete intel. Chain flagged. Naomi exhaled softly, not in relief, but in recognition, the pattern already forming in her mind, familiar in its structure, predictable in its flaw. She typed a short response, her thumbs moving with precision. Hold internal review. Do not notify local unit yet. Then she paused, her gaze lifting slightly, considering, measuring the weight of what came next. She added one more line. I will handle direct contact. She sent the message and slipped the phone back into her pocket, the decision settling into place without hesitation. Naomi walked toward the table again, her hand brushing lightly against the surface as she passed, then moved to the small cabinet near the wall, opening it quietly. Inside, neatly arranged folders sat in precise order, each labeled, each part of a system built over time. She selected one, pulling it out and opening it just enough to confirm its contents before closing it again. The file was not thick, but it did not need to be. She tucked it under her arm and turned back toward the center of the room, her eyes moving once more to the door, to the line where would met broken frame. It was still there, unchanged, but now it felt less like damage and more like evidence. Naomi stepped closer to it, crouching slightly, her fingers hovering just above the splintered edge, not touching, just observing. The break was clean in some places, rough in others, a force applied without pause, without question. She studied it for a moment longer, then stood, her expression calm but resolved. The night had given her everything she needed. She turned and walked toward the coat rack, reaching for a small set of keys hanging from a hook, the metal clinking softly as she lifted them. Her movements remained quiet, controlled, but there was a new direction in them now, a forward motion that did not look back. Naomi paused near the couch, her eyes briefly scanning the space one more time, not to check, but to acknowledge. The blanket folded neatly, the legal pad set aside, the pen aligned, the glass in the sink. Everything in its place, not as it had been before, but as it needed to be now. She reached for the jacket collar, adjusting it slightly, then moved toward the door again. This time, she did not stop short. She reached for the chair and pulled it back slowly, the soft scrape against the floor deliberate, controlled, clearing the path without hesitation. The door shifted slightly as the pressure changed, the gap widening just enough to allow movement. Naomi placed her hand against the wood, steadying it, then pushed it open carefully, the broken frame resisting slightly before giving way. The hallway beyond was dim, quiet, empty, but it did not feel the same as before. It felt like an extension of the moment, a space that now held consequence. Naomi stepped into the doorway, the cooler air brushing against her face, her posture straight, her gaze forward. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She stepped out into the hallway, her shoes silent against the floor, the door left slightly open behind her, not fully closed, not fully abandoned. As she walked down the corridor, her presence carried a different weight, not authority imposed, but authority understood. The building remained still, doors closed, lights dim, but something in the air had shifted, subtle but real. Naomi reached the stairwell at the end of the hall and paused for a brief second, her hand resting on the railing, her eyes lifting upward, then downward, mapping the space instinctively. Then she moved, descending with quiet purpose, each step measured, each breath even. The night outside would be waiting, the city still moving, the system still operating on assumptions that had gone unchecked for too long. But Naomi Carter did not move on assumption. She moved on clarity. And as she stepped out of the building into the cool, early morning air, the faint glow of streetlights stretching across the pavement, she did not look back. The line had been crossed. Now it would be followed. The city air felt different than the room she had left behind. Cooler, wider, carrying movement instead of memory, and Naomi stepped onto the sidewalk without breaking her pace, her eyes already adjusting to the dim glow of streetlights stretching across the block. The building behind her stood quiet, its windows dark, its hallway now just another corridor in a city full of them. But she knew what it held, and more importantly, what it had revealed. She walked toward her car parked along the curb, the faint reflection of her silhouette moving across its surface as she approached, keys already in her hand. The metal clicked softly as she unlocked the door, the sound precise, controlled, and she slid into the driver's seat. With the same measured calm she had carried all night. The interior held a faint scent of leather and something clean, something familiar, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to sit still, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, her gaze forward, not yet starting the engine. The dashboard clock read 2:41 a.m. Time had moved, but not enough to erase anything. Naomi reached for her phone again, placing it in the holder near the console, the screen lighting softly as she tapped once, pulling up a secure line. She did not dial immediately. Instead, she looked through the windshield at the empty street ahead, the faint hum of a traffic light cycling at the corner, the red glow reflecting off the pavement in slow, steady pulses. Then she pressed the call button. The line connected quickly this time. "Carter," she said again, her voice low but firm, the same calm that had carried her through the night now sharpened by direction. "I am heading to the precinct." A pause. She listened, her expression unchanged. "No," she replied quietly. Do not alert them yet. I want to see how they hold their own narrative first. Her eyes shifted slightly, catching a movement in the side mirror, a car passing slowly behind her, then disappearing down the block. Pull me everything tied to that unit, she continued. Prior entries, complaint logs, any flag patterns within the last 6 months. I do not want summaries. I want full context. Another pause. She nodded once, though no one could see it. Good. Send it to my secure channel. She ended the call and placed the phone down, her fingers resting against it for a second before withdrawing. Naomi started the engine, the low hum filling the car, steady, controlled, and she eased out from the curb, the tires rolling smoothly onto the street. The city opened around her, not busy, but alive in its own quiet way, lights blinking, distant movement threading through empty lanes. She drove without rush, her speed measured, her attention focused not just on the road, but on the thoughts forming beneath the surface. The entry had not been random. The authorization chain had not been complete, and the certainty in Hayes' voice when he had stepped into her home had not come from nowhere. It had been built, reinforced, repeated. Naomi turned at the next intersection, the traffic light shifting from red to green as she approached, the change smooth, uninterrupted, and she moved through it without slowing. Her mind worked the same way, connecting pieces, aligning patterns, not jumping to conclusions, but not ignoring what was already clear. The radio remained off. She did not need noise. The quiet inside the car mirrored the quiet she carried, steady, grounded, intentional. A few blocks ahead, the outline of the precinct came into view, its exterior lights casting a wider glow across the street, the flag out front barely moving in the still air. Naomi slowed slightly as she approached, pulling into the lot with controlled precision, the tires crunching softly against the gravel edge before settling into a space near the entrance. She turned off the engine, the hum fading, leaving only the faint ticking of cooling metal. For a moment, she sat there again, her hands resting lightly on the wheel, her eyes on the building ahead. It looked ordinary, functional, just another part of the system. But she knew systems did not reveal themselves all at once. They revealed themselves in moments like the one she had just left. Naomi reached for the folder beside her, opening it briefly, scanning the first page, then closing it again. Everything she needed was already in motion. She stepped out of the car, the door closing with a soft, solid sound behind her, and walked toward the entrance, her steps steady, her posture straight, the jacket settling naturally with each movement. The night had not ended. It had shifted, and as she reached for the door of the precinct, her reflection briefly catching in the glass, there was no hesitation in her gaze, only clarity, only purpose, and the quiet certainty that what had begun as a mistake would not end without being understood. The glass door opened with a soft mechanical click, and Naomi stepped inside without hesitation, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights replacing the stillness of the street behind her, the air inside carrying the faint scent of paper, coffee, and something institutional that never quite left buildings like this. The front desk officer looked up, mid-shift, mid-thought, his expression neutral at first, then sharpening as recognition flickered across his face, not of who she was, but of what she represented. Naomi did not slow her pace. Her footsteps echoed lightly across the polished floor, steady, controlled, her presence neither loud nor hidden, simply undeniable. I need to speak with Officer Daniel Hayes, she said, her voice calm, even, not raised, but carrying clearly through the quiet lobby. The officer blinked once, caught off guard by the directness, then reached for the phone without asking further questions, his movements quick but slightly uncertain. Naomi stood still as he made the call, her gaze drifting briefly across the room, taking in the details with practiced precision, the bulletin board with outdated notices, the half-empty coffee cup left near the corner of the desk, the faint reflection of herself in the glass partition separating the front area from the rest of the precinct. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, and yet, everything connected. He is here, the desk officer said after a moment, his tone quieter now. He will be out in a second. Naomi nodded once, her expression unchanged. She did not sit. She did not lean. She simply stood, grounded, her hands relaxed at her sides, the jacket resting naturally on her shoulders, the badge still unseen but present. A door opened somewhere down the hall, followed by footsteps approaching, measured but not as steady as before. Hayes stepped into view, his uniform still crisp, but his posture slightly different than it had been earlier, the confidence now tempered by awareness, by memory. He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes meeting hers, and for a brief moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had already happened. "Agent Carter," he said finally, the words careful, respectful, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging without softening. "Officer Hayes," she replied, her tone steady, neutral. "No accusation, no greeting, just recognition." He glanced briefly toward the desk, then back at her, as if aware that this conversation did not belong to the room they were standing in. "We can talk in my office," he offered. Naomi did not respond immediately. She held his gaze for a second longer, measuring, not his words, but his understanding. Then she nodded once. "Lead the way." Hayes turned, his steps slower now, more deliberate, and Naomi followed, her presence quiet but constant behind him. They moved down the hallway, passing closed doors, dim lights, the low murmur of distant voices that faded as they went deeper into the building. Hayes opened the door to his office and stepped aside, allowing her to enter first, a small shift, but one that did not go unnoticed. Naomi stepped inside, her eyes scanning the space briefly, the desk, the chair, the files stacked in controlled order, the computer screen still glowing faintly. She did not sit. She remained standing near the center of the room, her posture relaxed but firm. Hayes closed the door behind them, the soft click sealing the space in quiet. "I reviewed the dispatch log," Naomi said, her voice calm, direct, moving past anything unnecessary. "The authorization chain was incomplete." Hayes nodded slowly, his jaw tightening slightly, not in resistance, but in acceptance. "Yes," he said. "We realized that after." Naomi's gaze did not shift. "After is not the point." The words were not harsh, but they landed with precision, the weight of them settling into the room. Hayes exhaled quietly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show that he understood. "You are right," he said. There was no defense in his voice, no attempt to redirect, just acknowledgement. Naomi took a small step forward, closing the distance slightly, not to confront, but to be clear. "You acted on certainty without confirmation," she continued, "and you carried that certainty into someone else's space." Hayes looked at her, his expression steady, but changed. "I did," he admitted. The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. It was not tension, it was recognition. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, then reached into her jacket, retrieving the folded page she had taken earlier. She placed it on his desk, the paper resting flat, simple, unremarkable. "This is not a report," she said quietly. "It is a record." Hayes looked down at it, then back at her, understanding settling slowly, deeply. Naomi stepped back, her posture easing slightly, not in weakness, but in completion. "What happens next is not about punishment," she added. "It is about correction." The words remained in the air, steady, final. Hayes nodded once, his expression serious, grounded. "Understood." Naomi turned toward the door, her hand resting briefly on the handle before she paused, her voice softer now, but no less clear. "Next time," she said, without turning back, "you knock." She opened the door and stepped out, her footsteps quiet against the hallway floor, her presence moving forward without hesitation. Behind her, the room remained still, the paper on the desk, the silence holding everything that had been said. And as Naomi walked out of the precinct into the fading night, the first hint of early morning light beginning to touch the horizon, nothing about her had changed. But something in the world around her had. And that was enough.